Right. Harriet, can you see the presentation?
I can't at the moment, I'm afraid, Simon.
Oh. What about now?
Something is happening now. I think it's just loading. Yes, I can see it now. Hopefully that's the same for everyone else.
Yes, I can see it, Harriet. Yeah.
Okay, great. I shall start then. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along today. Basically, today I'm going to go through the new FOD map for planning and how it should be used by planners and the people involved in strategic flood risk assessments, local plan, or registration staff, development management stuff. I'm not going to go into the technical details of how the maps were produced. There are far better recordings online explaining all that, and I've got a link to that. Thanks. Before we actually crack on with it all, I think it's always a good idea to remember why we're here, what we're trying to do. And what we're trying to do is stop things happening again like they've happened in the past and make communities be able to become more resilient to climate change and adapt to it. And that's the key bit. Got a few photographs there of various flooding events over the past nearly 100 years, because the one in the middle is Torquay in 1938. So it's not just climate change that's causing the flooding, it's we're putting buildings in either the wrong place or not allowing them to adapt properly to the flood risks. Since January 2025, we have produced 3 new loads of mapping, and they all show data in a slightly different way and all should be used in different ways. And I do apologise for that, because the government likes to make things all difficult and hard to understand. So I'm going to go through the first 2 very briefly, and the final one with the flood map for planning. The first one is something called Check Your Long-Term Flood Risk. This is aimed at homeowners, not the LPAs or developers. It includes the effects of defences, climate change, which is different or not appropriate for planning matters, and some of the surface water mapping is different as well. But you may see this in the flood risk assessment that developers produce. The next major change is the new sort of Shoreline Management Plan Explorer, or sometimes called the Coastal Erosion Explorer, which provides information along the coastlines of the predicted erosion rates, whether we carry out the Shoreline Management Plan actions or not. This will be useful to the people producing local plans or development management and even registration, because quite a few of this information is being used to produce coastal change management areas, which I know we've got in East Devon, North Devon, Cornwall, South Hams and Torquay at the moment. And so, it's going to be used for that information in the way that it can be used in the system. I'm going to be also talking about the new flood map for planning. It initially came out in March 2025, but we had an update in August of this year due to some changes that were asked for. And basically, the main message is carry on using them in exactly the same way you were using before. Use them to screen consultations, use them in your forward planning, and consult us in exactly the same way. They are still mostly appropriate to be used for level 1 strategic flood risk assessments. They should, as I said, use before screenings for the need for flood risk assessments, whether to consult the Environment Agency or whether our national flood risk standing advice or our local flood risk standing advice applies. And then in the development management world, it's a starting point for sequential tests. They are also a key way of getting information for developers, and it's only a starting point to produce their flood risk assessments. I put a link there onto the gov.uk website so that you can actually see the official definition of how they can be used and when they shouldn't be used. The main difference is what's new. In March of this year, we published a new flood map for planning. That's on the left-hand side. And it showed a lot of information of the new flood zones, rivers and sea flooding with defences, without defences, surface water flooding, different storm sizes, climate change ones, and many other factors. And a lot of the feedback we got, people were saying that those maps were too complicated. There's too much going on. And also there was an issue with some of the way that it showed the mapping, that people with visual disabilities weren't viewing them very well. So they've come up with a new way of doing it, a much simplified version, and also have simplified the flood zones. It's also merged the climate change, so rather than being on several different layers, it's on one layer. And we've also included these, what I call these dotted areas there on the maps. This has excluded the national model for technical reasons. I'll go on in a bit to explain about that. As I said, there are far better explanations of the new science behind the new national model, or the new NAFRA mapping, and the coastal erosion mapping online. And I've got a link there. We will share the presentation after these workshops. The key big difference in the new mapping is that the accuracy has got better. Some of the old flood map for planning maps were on 50 by 50 meter grids. What we've done now, we've gone down to a 2 meter by 2 meter grids, and so that it's accurate to street level. It's never accurate to property level, because we don't know about thresholds and how many steps you go into a house or down into the house. But the main difference is we are more confident with this new national mapping. Now, some of the old mapping that we had was also to 2 meters, but that is where we had locally detailed flood modelling that we were able to use to update the flood zones, but it didn't cover all the locations. The other big thing that was about our map that we produced in March was that sometimes it's very hard to see the underlying information. And so what they made available is that the actual background maps can be changed from a color to either black, dark, and also to black and white. And it does show up some of the information more easily if you can zoom in. The other big difference with the flood map compared to the other mapping, you can zoom right into street level. The previous mapping stopped at a certain scale, so you couldn't zoom in. One of the biggest differences is the new climate change. This has all been merged into one simplified layer and is shown here in a salmon or orange or pink color, depending on your sort of a definition of that. And it's a lot easier to see on the maps to zoom in. But as I said, some of these areas that we've done have been excluded from the new publication. So that dotted area you can see on the right-hand side basically says that we have a better detailed modeling that's available through product requests for developers or for yourselves. You're doing local plans or risk management work, but it wasn't quite suitable to be put into the new national model at that stage. We've got a series of planned updates over the next couple of years to try and get rid of as many of these as we can as possible. But the main key point of this is that if you are looking in a site in those orange areas, you're to treat it as flood zone 2. So whether you consult us or whether you do local flood risk standing advice, or in terms of, say, coastal erosion issues, how you treat it with your development management and your local plan policies. There's a link there again as well to explain how that was all used on the Gov website, and it's quite clear and concise about what's going to do. However, there are a lot of issues with this new national modelling. Now, it is the best available national modelling. However, in many local locations, there are a lot of problems, and we are finding them as we reviewed the maps, and hence why we've had those dotted out areas and said, no, don't use the new mapping, use the old mapping. But also as development sites come forward or reach reserve matter stage rather than outline stage, we've had quite a few problems. And in many instances, the extent of the floodplains is either getting bigger or smaller or non-existent. One example we've had recently is near Trago Mills in Newton Abbot, and on the left-hand side you can see that the flood map is smaller than the right-hand side, which is the new modelling. The reason for that is that we had a detailed model as part of the planning permission for the outline stage, so we were able to say, it's great, no problems, we can adjust the flood zone maps to match what we found in the flood risk assessment. However, the new national modelling didn't use that detailed modelling because it didn't meet our standards to be able to change it. So it's got bigger again. And at reserve matter stage, it suddenly said, oh, hold on a sec, there's a lot more flood risk here than we previously thought. We've worked with the planning authority to say, no, actually, the old stuff is still appropriate. There's no need to do any extra work. In other parts, it's when it's got a lot smaller. I do apologise to them. It's not the best example, but it's a good example that we found that in Mothercombe in Torquay, the sort of lighter area was the old mapping, and you might just be able to see the dark blue area is the new mapping, and it significantly shrinks the flood risk area. This is because the new national mapping doesn't work very well for small catchments, and that's anything under sort of 5-10 kilometres squares. And We have discussed this with our national colleagues, and they are considering all the problems that can be done and how we can resolve it, and we are working with them. What we did in the past locally, we used the surface water mapping instead to emphasize the problems and to convert into flood zones. And now that hasn't happened in all the new mapping. Hence why I found a water course up in Bideford this week that the flood zone mapping has completely disappeared. The guidance is to use the new mapping, but if you have previous planning applications like an outliner which is changing into reserve matters, use the old mapping, but ultimately come and talk to ourselves in the Environment Agency for the flood zone maps. There's a reason why I emphasize the flood zone maps, and you'll see that in a minute. The other problem is something we call dry islands. In many locations, sometimes you might have an area of the floodplain which is slightly raised above all the surrounding areas. And as you can see here on the left, there's one or two areas which are highlighted a light pink, so we're in flood zone 2 rather than the darker blue. On the right hand side is the new mapping, and you can see there's a lot more of those islands or highlighted by flood zone 2. Again, this is a technical issue, and they hope to resolve some of these in the future, but who knows when we'll get the final approval and all the models rerun to show all this. And the basic consideration is a flood risk assessment is still required, and they must consider the flood zone 2 all the way around them, and also climate change might mean that they now become flood zone 3 with the impacts of climate change, and they still have to consider safe access and egress. The other big issue is functional floodplain. One of the new outputs that we have provided is something for the 3.3% chance in any year, or the 1 in 30 chance in any year floodplain. That has quite often been referred to as the functional floodplain. However, functional floodplains are only defined in the strategic flood risk assessments because we need to make sure we are using the best available mapping from whatever source. Now, some of the issues we found, as you can see this on the left-hand side, the 1 in 30 flood is bigger than the 1 in 100 flood. So this is Barnstable, and you can see that the red area is much bigger than the blue area. And there's no reason why it should be. It actually should not be bigger. And so that's one problem we found. Some of the other problems we found is that the flood risks disappear completely, or it doesn't take proper account of the flood defences. So the one on the right is Ashburton, and the two smaller circles just show that the floodplain disappears. And if you know Ashburton, that area actually floods, and there should be no reason why it disappears. But that big central circle is where we have a massive flood culvert, so 6-foot diameter or 1.8 meters diameter, protecting that area. And in a 1 in 30 flood, that area would not flood. We've got detailed modelling for this. So we don't know why this has happened. And that's why we're clearly saying to developers and to yourselves, do not use them carte blanche without talking to us first. Some places they're really good, but a lot of places they are bad. But that can be part of the strategic flood risk assessments that you do with us and through those conversations. Another big issue is surface water mapping. That has changed as well. And I think the best way of describing is use this with an extreme amount of care. Come and talk to us about your area and your communities, and ask the lead local flood risk authorities about there. Now, I know that in Plymouth, for example, the surface water mapping isn't bad for them. It matches some of the old stuff and what we know to happen. But in Torquay, it's particularly bad. And I don't know whether Dave or Mike wants to come in at this point to sort of say, yes, how bad they are. Don't have to.
Yes. Okay. So yeah. Certainly it's actually Torquay, Paynton, and Brixham. All of them on the new map show far less flooding and in different areas. So we've got major areas that we know are at risk for flooding. On the one you're showing there of Torquay, just at the top on the left-hand plan, you've got the town hall, which we know we've got history of it flooding at the back of the town hall, flooding it, and it's shown quite well on the legacy results. New results, there's absolutely nothing shown at the back of the town hall, and yet we know it floods to 2.5 meters deep there. It's actual natural dam on the surface water runoff and ponds there. You can see also down Union Street, Fleet Street, the main roads coming down where we've got photos of it, virtually a river running down it. The new ones just do not show it. So, as you're aware, Simon, we are actually doing our own surface water modelling as part of our SFRA update, which hopefully will be passed to yourselves and will be adopted by the EA to put in and replace the NAFRA 2 data for, as I say, Paynton, Brixham and Torquay. But yeah, we have major issues with developers trying to use the new ones at the moment and saying, oh, we haven't got a flood risk now anymore, and that. And we're having to say no. The one thing that I would just highlight is that obviously, and you must cover it in your thing, we can't actually give them the legacy maps now because we can't get hold of them. So that's just something that perhaps you'll cover later on in the presentation.
Thank you for that, Dave.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a big problem. The key message is come and talk to ourselves or the LLFAs who cover your patch. Many of you might be aware that there was a significant change to the NPPG, so it's the National Planning Policy Guidance Notes, about the sequential test, sequential approach, flood risk assessments, but it applies to surface water flooding only. The key thing there is, it says that if you can manage the flood risk within your site, i.e. you could quite handle design the site so that you build in the non-flood risk area and you can move the surface water risk or flow route or whatever within a safe part of the site with appropriate land uses, the sequential test may not need to apply. And obviously it has to be shown by the flood risk assessments, and we can provide you with a briefing note on that and we can just discuss that further, but it is a significant change from the previous one. And also, to make it clear, it's only surface water. It is not fluvial. It is not tidal, coastal, or the other sources like surface sewer or groundwater. Right. We have teamed up with the Town and Country Planning Association to provide a lot of information on their website about all the new mapping. And on there, I provided a link to the briefing notes that you should have been previously provided with. Also, a video explaining, probably better than me in some ways, some of the new mapping functions, and just some links to many other things. The key thing is this guidance note here. This clearly explains which maps should be used for which purposes, and they are color-coded so that they're sort of saying that this data should not be used for planning, this data should be used with a pinch of salt, and also with consultation with ourselves, and the green stuff is fine. So the flood map for planning is generally okay, apart from surface water, as I just expressed. But the likes of the check your long-term flood risk data, which a lot of consultants put in their flood assessments, are really not suitable for use in a flood assessment. They can be used to form a picture, but the first point of call or the determination of where it's in this flood zone or that flood zone should be the flood map for planning. That is a key document, and it's easily downloadable from the website from there. The other big thing that they have on the TCPA website is lots of training courses or videos on various approaches which can be used, sequential test, sequential approach, functional floodplain and things like that. And it's a very useful tool, and I get all our staff to go and do them, as they are really good training for new people into the system and old people like myself. At this point, I'm going to hand over to Harriet, because she's going to go do a quick explanation of how the consultation with us hasn't changed and some of the key factors of that. Harriet?
Thanks, Simon. Yes, I mean, I think you've kind of covered it there. The main point from us in the Sustainable Places team is just to cover here today a couple of slides to highlight that despite the changes to the flood maps, despite the changes to flood data, there is no change to when we are being consulted or when we need to be consulted, and of course no change to the way in which we are consulted. So we're still working from the same external consultation checklist, which you can see on the screen. We've only highlighted the relevant parts for today, but most of you will know it's a couple of pages long and it covers all the matters within our remit. But today we're focusing on flood risk. So to keep things quick, speaking in very general terms, new development in flood zone 3, of course, will need to be sent to us for a consultation. There are some caveats to that depending on the scale of development. And actually, if you were at the RTPI day yesterday and you opted to do the afternoon session with our colleague Marcus Salmon on the National Flood Risk Standing Advice, you'll be, all square on when to consult us and when not to consult us. But it's just worth remembering that those smaller scale or lower vulnerability developments can often be covered by the National Flood Risk Standing Advice. We also want to be consulted on highly vulnerable developments in flood zone 2, as always, and more vulnerable in flood zone 2, but only if it's landfill, waste development, caravan or camping, that sort of thing. There's a note in here about critical drainage areas, but I think we've got colleagues from lots of different LPAs here today. So in Cornwall, things are slightly different to how we do things in Devon with the CDAs. Outside of Plymouth in Devon, it's only green CDAs. So as I understand it, that means the consultations need to go to the lead local flood authority. But of course, if you've got queries, then there's no problem picking up the phone or dropping us an email to clarify that. In Plymouth, we obviously have a green and a red CDA, and we've got a good system of when to consult us and when not to consult us. And in Cornwall, we have both green and red CDAs, and that depends on the size of the development, as in if it's over 1 hectare, you come to us for a consultation. I've got those links on the slide there as well for the National Flood Risk Standing Advice, and those two are particularly the two that are most useful, one of which has quite a useful part in it which breaks it down by flood zone. So flood zone 1, when you should and should not be consulting us, flood zone 2, flood zone 3, etc. Then the other part of the external consultation checklist there that we've highlighted is the works affecting a main river, and this will be really easy identified now that we've got the main river consultation area map layer. Thank you, Simon. Perfect cue. And that just means that it's now really obvious if the development itself, or even if part of the red line boundary of the proposal is within that area, that it's an automatic consultation to us. It's obviously worth checking for other matters that may affect our remit as well. The point of the map on the right hand side here as well is just to highlight that it's not necessarily the entirety of a river or a tributary that is designated as the main river. It can be quite strange how it's designated. So the main river consultation area only aligns to where that designation is. So it's always worth double checking on that layer. Yes, thank you, Simon. Perfect. This is just to highlight sort of the strategic planning side that we work on as well. So it's a reminder that we can be involved in local plan preparations, some of which is statutory work, some of which is not. And many of you will know that where it's not statutory, we do recover our costs, but in particular relating to flood risk data and the flood risk mapping, we can support particularly the development of the SFRAs, the strategic flood risk assessments, levels 1 and level 2, and any allocations as well. And then the last slide from me, please, Simon, before I hand back to you. So this is just a slide that's got lots of links. They should all work because I went through and double checked them this week. Just sort of a library for support on when to consult us, how to use the data, how to use the National Standing Advice, SFRA guidance, all those sorts of things. So hopefully that can be useful, but we're always here for any questions. I think at the very end of this presentation, Simon's got a slide with our contact details. So yes, any queries, please just let us know. And I'll hand back to Simon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harriet. Right, final section. The other big thing that's changed is that we've produced something called a flood risk assessment template and accompanying guidance notes. And this is available on the planning portal. And we are asking if you could put the link to the planning portal and the FRA template in your responses back to any applicant or developer that you're in contact with, just so they know where to go. But more importantly, that they start producing flood risk assessments, which we're all happy with or happier with. The actual template itself is fairly simplistic. It literally is just the sections that people could be talking about. They don't have to fill in every section. And I know we'll still get discussions on tidal flooding on Dartmoor or on Exmoor, but in most cases, they should fill out the bits that are relevant to them. The good thing about this is that it should help provide the right information for the developments that they are doing with. For example, quite frequently I see they don't provide a design flood level or a site survey to meet as AOD if you're near the coast, but it carefully and in a structured manner goes through each section on what the flood risk assessment should consider in that part, and also what sort of data they should get. I think it'll be particularly useful for an example in our local flood risk standing advice on change of use, because the key point for that is to give you information on what is the flood level and what is the floor level. And provided that is provided quite clearly, you can apply the guidance very simply. And I know that lots of problems have been when the smaller developers or smaller consultants haven't provided that information. This is a good way of doing it, and hopefully there will be a revision of this once we start getting comments back from the users on any particular changes that they want to do. The last thing probably we're going to talk about is really the data that's available on the data.gov.uk site. And the key thing is, if you could please download data feeds rather than layers. That way you know you're using the latest data. We've already had 3 updates since March. And I know there's some more coming in the January to April period on extra information, both for surface water and for the flood zone maps, on additional information that they can get through the web browsers. At the end of this presentation, I've got lots of slides, which I won't go through, to give you an indication of what's available so that your GIS people can understand what's available. But there was one particular one which I thought might be very useful for some of you. Particularly for those people preparing the local plan, or if you're looking at a community and want some information about flooding. It's a spatial data set which does property counts, postcodes, and key summary statistics about some geographic boundaries. Now, it doesn't cover everywhere, and I don't know how good it is in Devon and Cornwall, but it should cover, I would say, the majority of the main communities and medium-sized communities. And it's really useful to give you an idea of how bad the flooding is in some of the information produced. Always come and have a chat about this. We're always willing to do that, but it might be a good way of doing it is for initial scanning for that area. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. Those are our contact details. As I said, we will provide this presentation in a PDF format for yourselves with all the links and the data things like that. So now if we move on to the questions, but I will stop the recording first if I can figure out how to do that properly. There we go. Stop recording.